supervision reform. However, before this role, I worked in county elections departments on and off for about 4 years, and most recently in Fulton County in their Office of Voter Registration and Elections. So I wanted to provide an informational presentation around voting and voting processes, and talk about exactly how it gets done, how you can register to vote, who can register to vote, and how you can actually vote. And we'll cover through that process a lot of the pitfalls, I think, that people run into in terms of voting. Quick disclaimer, we are focusing on the November elections, the general election that's coming up, which is very important. You do have to register for each election in Georgia, so I wouldn't want any of these deadlines to stick in anyone's mind for future elections, for special elections, or future runoffs, but it's really important we also talk about dates as well. So just a quick disclaimer, we're going to focus on the general election, but a lot of these voting rules will apply to everyone. So I'm going to try to wrap in a little less than 20 minutes. So if there's any issues or any questions, that we'll be able to do that. But starting with eligibility, that was one of the poll questions, is whether or not who's eligible to vote. So eligibility in Georgia is focused on age, on residence, and on your legal status. So you do have to be 17 and a half to register to vote. You do have to be 18 years of age before you can vote. However, your legal status and your residence also have to be confirmed by the state of Georgia. So you do have to have a legal Georgia address. You cannot vote in Georgia if you are also registered to vote in some other state. And you cannot be considered mentally incompetent by any judge or any judicial official. And most importantly, you can't be serving a sentence for a felony conviction. So in the poll question, we wanted to gauge how well everyone understood this, because this has been a very heavily debated topic, and there's been national changes, and every state really handles this differently because they're allowed to. So in the state of Georgia, if you've been convicted of a felony, a lot of people do believe that you can never again vote, and that is not true. You can just not be serving your sentence for that felony. And usually, if you've been convicted of a felony in Georgia, you're quite aware of it, but it's not always clear whether or not you're still serving your sentence, because that is such an individual thing, because Georgia historically has not had a piece of paper or something, a completion certificate that says, hey, I'm done, I'm off of community supervision. Oftentimes leaving confinement is one part of a felony sentence, but it's not always the entire thing. So if you are currently serving your sentence on probation or on parole, and it was for a felony offense that you were convicted of, then you are not eligible to vote. But that leaves a lot of other people who are eligible to vote and are not exercising their rights. And you do have to exercise them to be able to vote. So as of 2019, the Department of Community Supervision did release a sentence completion certificate. If you have not heard of that, you are not alone. A lot of people are not aware of these completion certificates, and they do not ask for them. The reason why they're important, even though you don't legally need them to vote, if there's any questions at all on behalf of the registrar about your status, it's going to present a problem for you. So you want to have this piece of paper that says that, yes, I'm able to vote, and you have to request that from the Department of Community Supervision. It looks like this. Again, a lot of folks don't have them. I can send out kind of an example of what they look like, but if you have any questions at all about whether or not you are done with your sentence, it's worth it to contact DCS. They have a phone number. Each county has their own site, so contact them if you think you may be done, you're not sure you're done, and just make sure that you can exercise that you're right and that you don't avoid voting out of fear of that alone. So moving on to registration. So you have to register to vote in Georgia for every single election you want to vote. If you're from another state, that's probably strange to you. There are some states where you can register once and be registered until you're not, but that's not the case in Georgia. You have to register for each election you want to vote in, whether it's a primary or a general election. So you can register up to 6 months in advance, but you do have to be registered by 30 days out, no matter what. So this year, that's October 5th. That you have to be registered by. And there's a few different ways that you can do that. You can register at the Department of Driver Services office. You can register at your county registrar's office. That may be called a board of elections. It may be called county voter registration, but your county registrar's office is where you can register to vote also. Local libraries are usually gonna enable you to vote as well. And you can also vote online. You can register to vote online, and you can register by email. Some counties have a really good system set up, and you can just call them and they can send you an application to register to vote. Other times it may be worth it to you to just go down there, to just swing by if it's in your county and just make sure you get an application to register to vote. biggest thing about registering to vote and about getting ready to vote is making a commitment to do so, which I think some of the ladies talked about a little bit earlier. So if you're not tech savvy, if it's not something you spent a lot of time with, you need to get very familiar. I encourage everyone to get very familiar with the My Voter page on the Secretary of State website. That's going to be your best possible resource to check your status. And even if you've been voting your whole life, I really recommend always checking your status before an election so that you don't have any last minute surprises. Go to that website. It's mvp.sos.ga.gov, and I'll repeat this link quite a few times, but that will also tell you the last place that you were registered. So if you need to switch your registration for any reason, you'll be able to do that there as well. If there's anyone who hasn't registered at all, and if it's your first time in Georgia, that's where some of the heavy lifting can come in sometimes, because you have to prove your residence. And they do require, however you want to register, they will require you to prove that you live in that county. So that could be a utility bill, it could be a bank statement, a government check, a paycheck. You will have to prove your residence if you've never registered in Georgia before. So it's important to keep that in mind and to give yourself extra time if you need to do that. Dates and deadlines, once again, October 5th is the deadline for this general election. It's always 30 days before. That's always the registration deadline. Online, if you can remember this website, and we'll also send it out, I'm sure, registertovote.sos.ga.gov. So that's abbreviated for registertovote.secretaryofstate.georgia.gov. Again, you can do so in person and you can do so by mail. After you've registered to vote, after you've submitted your application to register to vote, you should receive a precinct card. You should receive a precinct card in the mail. This is a very important card. You don't have to have it once you've got everything else in place and once you've been a registered voter for a while, but make sure that you do get your precinct card. It's their obligation to send it to you once you've registered to vote. That card is going to show you exactly what location you can vote in on election day, if that's what you choose to do. And they're required to send that out to you. And that information, the moment that information changes, that's when you'll want to make changes to your registration. So that should be the follow-up step after you've registered to vote. Common issues you could run into is, what if you have to move? What if you've moved within the last 30 days or so? Say if you move between now and the middle of October, per se, as long as it's between 30 days of the election, so as long as it's still 30 days out within that window, you can still vote in your old precinct, which a lot of people aren't aware of. So if you've always lived in DeKalb, you've always voted at the same location, now you're moving to a Gwinnett, you don't know your way around, as long as it's within 30 days since you've moved, you can still vote in your old precinct. If it has been even 31 days or 32 days, so if you are moving to Gwinnett and the first day in that new place is going to be October 1st, right? Well, that's more than 30 days out from the election. That's technically 32 days out. And so you will no longer be able to vote in DeKalb because you're not within the 30-day window. So the best way to avoid the situation, if you know you're going to move, if it's already a done deal, just get your address updated early with the county registrar. Don't wait and wind up in a confusing spot, especially if you want to vote in person on election day. Try to make plans to make sure that you'll know exactly where you have to vote if you're going to vote in person. That's the best way to avoid that issue. Other things could involve name changes, right? So sometimes we get married or we have a different change of name. You have to update that within 30 days of the name change. That's the most important thing. If you're not moving, it's fine. You can continue to vote exactly where you are, but you want to have the same name. Even if you used to go by your maiden name or you used to be hyphenated and now on your license you're no longer hyphenated, try to update all of your documentation at least 30 days out, just so you don't avoid any issues if you want to vote in person when you get to that polling place. Another thing that can frequently go wrong when it comes to your registration applications is whether or not your registration has become inactive in the state of Georgia. There's been a lot of conversation about purging voters from the rolls, where I think we're all very aware of that situation in the state of Georgia, and Georgia made headlines because of it. Technically, it's a national policy that states have to update their voter rolls. They have to have up-to-date information every 4 years or so. They have to clean those lists all the time. Georgia's policy, which made headlines most recently, was about inactivating registrations if people did not vote over a certain amount of time. Essentially, if you had no contact with the elections office. So if the elections office sent you a letter and they got return mail sent back, if you did move and maybe you did like mail forwarding through USPS, that's something that they find out about and it appears you've moved. So if for any reason you've had no contact, you've not voted, you haven't updated your registration at the Department of Driver Services, then you could become inactive Being inactive does not mean that you are not registered. It just means you're inactive. It means you're at risk of being purged or canceled. So those are two different things. Inactive is sort of this middle ground, which means that if you don't make contact with the elections office, then your registration will be canceled. But all that you have to do, if you have gotten a letter, one of those many letters that went out that says that you're inactive, is just vote. And the moment you vote again, you'll be active. That rule was changed from 3 years to 5 years. But if you know that you only vote in presidential elections, like many people do, you want to vote in every election. But if you only vote in presidential elections, then that means that chances are you don't have a lot of contact with your office, and you really want to check your registration. Go to My Voter page, check your registration, just to see if you haven't been, maybe you become inactive and you didn't even know it. So that's probably the bottom line, I'll say, as far as registration goes. And another point to this, especially if you didn't register yourself, because I know a lot of us are a part of churches or community groups, anyone can hold a registration drive, and those are great activities, but technically it's always on the voter to make sure that they're registered. So if you got registered at a function that you know was held by a social event or a social club, there's a chance that maybe they didn't submit the transmittal sheets, or maybe they waited a long time to do that. The onus is always going to be on you to register to vote. It cannot fall back on your church or on your community. So always make sure that you're registered. If you know that you signed up at a drive or on campus, go to My Voter page, but early the next week, and just make sure that they did everything that they were supposed to do, because they can't be held responsible if they didn't complete that paperwork. Okay, ways to vote. I'm going to try to move along here. There's two different technical ways to vote. The first is whether you want to vote by mail. The next is in person. So voting by mail is absentee voting. That's essentially the same thing, whether you're overseas and you are on active duty, whether you're overseas because you're traveling. But if you want to vote by mail, meaning you don't want to stand in the line, you don't want to go to a polling location, then you are technically absentee voting. Why would you want to absentee vote? Voting by mail is very safe. It's very convenient. We are still technically in the middle of a pandemic. You don't have to worry about long lines if you want to vote by mail. It's an easy way that you can kind of take your time as well. If you're a researcher, like so many folks I know on this call, I'm sure are, and you want to take some time and Google these candidates and Google these, ballot measures, and you want the internet as your friend to do that, then you may want to vote by mail. It can give you an opportunity to take your time, go through, the whole sample ballot and make sure that you're comfortable with everything. And voting by mail is a good option as well. If you do happen to be in jail, maybe you're serving a misdemeanor sentence, and maybe you're in jail, you can still vote, and you'll want to vote absentee. You still contact your county office just like the rest of us, and you can request an absentee ballot, and you can still vote whether or not you're in confinement if you're incarcerated. So that's a good option for a lot of folks. You can request an absentee ballot online really easily. There's a whole portal that's been set up. It's ballotrequest.sos.ga.gov. ballotrequest.sos.ga.gov. Go to Secretary of State's website if you need one. You can call your county registrar's office. Many states have like an email set up just for absentee ballots that you can request them on. Some of them are even taking them by social media if you give them your information. So it's very easy to get an absentee ballot, and at least that way you can take your time with it if you're someone who really wants that opportunity, doesn't want to be in a line and wait, and doesn't want to be waited on. It's a good idea, and it's safe. Biggest things to watch out for in absentee applications, though, is that they're often incomplete. USPS has warned us that there may be delivery delays, and so I highly discourage folks from waiting until Halloween to try to put their absentee ballots in the mail. It's not a good idea. You want to give yourself time for anything that could have been wrong, whether you didn't sign it, which happens a lot. People don't date it, that happens a lot. Typos, issues, whatever. Give yourself a little bit of lead time there, especially if you're using USPS. If you want to be safe, and I recommend this if you're going to vote by mail, at least drop it off at a drop box. Every county will have various drop box locations. Some counties will only have 1 or 2, especially smaller ones. Others have up to 20. I think there's 17 or more in Cobb County, if I'm not mistaken. So putting it in a drop box could be a very convenient method for you. You don't have to worry about the traditional mail process. You can also drop it off in person. You can go right to the county registrar and drop off your absentee ballot. You can track your absentee ballot on the SOS website as well, on the My Voter page, so that's a very useful tool. It's also a way to make sure that you're keeping election officials accountable if you know you've submitted it and you don't see it there. It's just a good way to make sure you're staying on top of your vote. Absentee ballots have to be received by 7 p.m. on the day of. So that is November 3rd by 7 p.m. If you put it in the mail on Halloween and they don't have it by then, there's nothing that anyone will be able to do for you if you wait until too late. So by 7 p.m., you can even If it's election day and you plan to vote by mail and you didn't get around to it, you can just drive to the county registrar's office and drop off your absentee ballot in person. So, but do that, and do it by 7 p.m. if you want that to count. So we talked about why ballots may get rejected. Make sure you've signed everything, make sure you've dated everything. And other ways to vote, if you like the experience of voting in person, many of us do, is to do that early or on election day. Voting early is a really good idea. I think we've all probably heard that from folks. Voting early gives you way more location options, because on election day, you can only vote at your assigned precinct, which you'll be able to see on your precinct card or on your My Voter page. But if you want to vote early, you can vote at any number of locations that your county offers to you. There's a mandatory Saturday voting day, which is going to be that last weekend in October. But you have a lot more options. You'll be able to go to more places, and that also may mean less lines, less waiting, depending on when you want to go throughout the day. So give yourself, I think, that courtesy. If you don't mind, if you don't have to vote on November 3rd, then you still can vote in person and just vote early. Last piece about that, early voting starts October 12th. That's a Monday, and it ends October 30th. That's a Friday. So between October 30th and November 3rd, there won't be any options for you to do early voting. Last piece, voting in person on election day. There are two different things that usually happen on election day. Most people who vote on election day will fill out a regular ballot. They'll show up, they'll have one of their pieces of identification, which we'll talk about, and they will just have a regular ballot. Other times, there may be an issue with your voting status or your registration that requires you to fill out a provisional ballot. This has happened a lot, especially during the primaries. I think this happened quite a bit. Someone showed up and their name wasn't on the list of the precinct, and so they had to get a provisional ballot. And provisional ballot is still a ballot. It's not an invalid ballot. There's a lot of reasons you may end up with a provisional. You could literally go up to your assigned precinct and have forgotten your ID in the car, and you've already waited 30 minutes and you don't want to go back to your car for your ID. Then if you do that, you will fill out a provisional ballot when you're there. A poll worker will give one to you. You'll fill it out the exact same way that you would a regular ballot, only after that point, the clock will start ticking. So a provisional ballot means that for some reason you could not be verified beforehand, whether it was the system's fault or something that you forgot to do, you couldn't be verified. And so you have 3 days from the time that you have voted to verify whatever information needed to be verified. So if it wasn't clear that that was your precinct, if you moved, had an address change, you will have 3 days until after you have filled out that provisional ballot to get the information to the county that they're looking for. If it's a name change, they'll need proof of that. If it's whatever it is, that's what they'll need proof of, and you'll have 3 days. So it may be worth it to you to just, follow up with the county. You may want to just decide to really try to correct whatever you have to correct beforehand. Things do happen. People do end up with provisional ballots, but ideally you want to get the regular ballot when you can, and just make sure that it's not because of something small. Important things about voting on the day of as well. 6 types of identification. So a passport. These are identification that have your photo on them for the most part. They can be expired though. That's okay. Expired pieces of ID are still valid in the state of Georgia. I'm going to list them off for you really quick. There's a U.S. passport. Employee identification, if you've worked for government, military, any other public branch. Tribal identification, if you are Native, you can have a student ID as long as it's from a university in the college in the system of Georgia. So no private institutions, but if it's UGA or GSU or something like that, you can use that ID on the actual voting day. And then you can use what's essentially called a voter ID card. This is a free voter ID. It can't be used for a driver's license, but it is free, that you can pick up at the Department of Driver Services or a library, or you can just request one. You cannot be turned away on voting day. No one can be turned away. So again, even if that means you have a provisional ballot because you're not in the right spot or they don't have the right information, you cannot be turned away from the polls, and do not leave if you are asked to turn away from the polls at all. You can bring your kids. That's totally fine. Don't wait in line if you don't have to. So if you show up on voting day between around 9:30 to 4 o'clock, and you are over the age of 75, or if you're disabled, you do not have to wait in line. You can skip the line. You can get a poll worker, let them know, and they will put you at the front of that line. So don't wait if you don't have to. That's if you're disabled, if you're over 75. If you make a mistake, check your ballot, because you may want to spoil that ballot. It's called a spoiled ballot. So once you go through this system, because we have a new voting system, you'll be able to print out a copy at that booth with all of your voting selections. If you made a mistake and you voted for the wrong president on accident or the wrong something on accident, tell the poll official they can spoil your ballot, essentially cancel it. They'll have to give you a new voting card. You'll start the process over, but it's a courtesy that they're trying to offer to you to make sure that you did all the right things and you weren't, rushing or mixing something up. So do check your ballot before you move from the booth to the actual scanner, which is where they'll take your paper slip. Just double check it as soon as you're done. The screen will let you do that before you print it out, but sometimes it's better to, some people just want to see it on paper, and once you have it on paper, double check that ballot. You cannot bring your phones to the actual booth. So once you get your voter card, you're not supposed to have your phone out, because you cannot take a picture of your ballot, and you cannot take a selfie of you, filling out your ballot. That's illegal. So don't do that. It's worth it you can get a sample ballot in advance and just mark it up, and you can keep this with you. You can keep sticky notes, but no electronic devices once you're actually voting. So be mindful of that. Again, it's another good reason to do your research, or at least to get a sample ballot in advance, because there's going to be ballot measures on there and referendums, very important stuff. And again, if you're not the type of person that can just read off paper and that you want to Google things, just be mindful you won't be able to do that once you're actually there. Final piece of information, reporting issues. There's a lot of groups here that I think are represented pretty often, but the ACLU has a voter hotline for reporting issues. Maybe that's a number we can follow up with, but you can also contact your county registrar, and you should do both. If you have any issues while you're voting, if someone is wearing some political paraphernalia in the middle of the voting booth, that's not acceptable. They're not allowed to do that. Nobody's allowed to tell you who to vote for. If you notice any sort of voter suppression or voter fraud, you do need to contact the county, but also contact, ACLU and folks who are doing a lot of work, Verified Action, folks who are doing a lot of work to make sure that everyone can vote and is able to vote. My last piece of reminders, I'll just say, make sure that you know the deadline is October 5th. Check your status, check it, see if you're registered to vote, see if your address is old, see if your name is old. Just double check that you're registered to vote, and then confirm it as often as you possibly can. There will be people to help you to vote. The poll officials are there to help. If you are bringing your whole family, which is a great thing to do, make sure that you're not assisting them without the poll worker permission once you're actually in the voting booth. So, for example, if you're already got your card and you see someone struggling, walking up to them is not necessarily a good idea. You want to tell the poll official you're there to assist them, because you're legally not allowed to help anyone to vote unless the poll official knows that that's what you're there to do, and they're actually supposed to make a note of it. But other than that, the most important thing, again, about voting is that even though the process is not easy, it's not designed to be easy. And I think with all difficult things, it's not a matter of how easy or hard it is. It's a matter of your commitment to doing it and making a habit of doing it. And once it's a habit, once you're engaged on a regular basis, it won't feel like such an exercise just to exercise your right to vote. So I know we've got more to the program, but if there's any follow-up, I think toward the end, and we have time to, I'm happy to.
I think maybe we could take a couple questions now. Perhaps people could put them in the chat. But if people have, because that was a lot of information, and thank you so much. But if people have some immediate questions, I think we should, is that okay, Pam? Take a few minutes.
We do have some questions in the chat.
Yes,
so
okay, well, go on.
Yeah, the first question was, are you stating repeated registrations? I think there was some clarity needed around when you started, Simone. Said some people thought that perhaps you were saying you have to register over and over and over. But so if you can clarify that, about registering to vote.
Sure. So what I mean for every election is that, say that there's a primary that was earlier this year that some folks turned out for. We had record turnout, but registering for the primary does not make you registered for the general election. So essentially, it's an entirely different election. And being registered for one does not mean that you're registered for another. So you don't have to register on like some sort of a semi-annual basis or an annual basis, but being registered right now for this upcoming election on November 3rd does not mean that you'll be registered to vote in the next presidential preference primary or in the next general election.
That I don't understand, because I have never re-registered.
I don't think that's quite right. I think that once you register, unless unless they drop you for some reason.
Essentially. That's a good clarifying point. That's a really good clarifying point. So the idea is, if you have not had the rules around not having contact, what I essentially mean is that you cannot, you cannot presume that your registration is still valid, for one. And let's say that you live in Atlanta and you're eligible for the special election. Everyone who's voting in one election is not necessarily voting in another election. So it's more a question of if there's another special election coming up, if there's a runoff coming up, you're not guaranteed to be able to vote in that election just because you voted in the most recent election. So I was really trying to draw a distinction between primaries and generals, because that's one, for one thing, could be partisan and one is not. But that's a good clarifying point.
And I think in Georgia, you just always need to check your registration because they purged our poll rolls constantly.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
And I'd just like to mention another thing that happened to me. I'm over 65, so I had signed up for absentee ballots, and I'm supposed to get them throughout 2020. But I had a problem with the absentee ballot that I was sent for the, what was that? I guess it was a primary election. And I hadn't received the corrected ballot. They made a mistake at Fulton County. I hadn't received the corrected ballot. And so I got nervous and I went in and voted in person. Well, for some reason, they then canceled my automatic request for absentee ballots. And I just found that out, just by happenstance. So you do have to check to make sure you're still scheduled to receive.
Yeah.
An absentee ballot.
Yeah, that's another important point, Bernadette. And another example that made me think about is when we move. So the address changes that come up, because if you go to a location and you're only allowed to vote for a certain area, like you just moved, that DeKalb Gwinnett example I gave, your provisional ballot would only allow you to vote for what you were allowed to vote for in the first place. So that's another example of the fact that you would become partially counted. And they're supposed to send you a letter and explain all of that to you. But again, it's a question of checking your status, knowing exactly where you're allowed to vote, and knowing if you're going to deviate from that at all, that you have to follow up about your registration for sure.
I had an experience in the primary. I live in Towns County in Northeast Georgia, which is a very sparsely populated county. I mailed in my absentee ballot more than a week before the election. And I did check online the day before the election and saw that it had not been received. And so I went in person and voted, but they called it, that an absentee ballot had been sent. And there's a form that I had to fill out invalidating the absentee ballot. So if you see, if you check and see that your absentee ballot has not been received, you won't go to jail for voting twice. You can just tell them, I sent it in, it showed it had not been received, so I need one of those forms to invalidate my absentee ballot. So go in person if that happens.
The other question that's come up, Simone, is about postage on the absentee ballots, about mailing them in. How much postage?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of folks recommend that you're supposed to have 2 pieces of postage or something just to make sure. And I'm not saying that that's not good advice. Legally, you're not supposed to be required to have to do that. I mean, there was just a conversation that I think a judge ruled that it's not considered some sort of a poll tax to make people provide their own postage.
I attended a recent forum similar to this one, and the issue on the postage is that it is more than the standard, what is it now, 1 stamp. It's not the value of 2 stamps, but it is more than 1 stamp. So we were highly advised to just go ahead and use 2 stamps, unless you go to the post office and get the exact amount of postage, but it is more than the value of the 1 stamp. So to be safe, we were advised to put an extra stamp.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing. I've heard the same thing.
They don't have the right to reject it, but there's so much surrounding the Postal Service now that you choose 50 cents, an extra 50 cents might be worth the effort.
Right.
I have a question. We are going to be offering free rides to early voting sites. What if one of the passenger hands us an absentee ballot to put into the ballot box? Is that legal?
Handing you an
In other words, they
absentee.
won't put it in themselves, you know.
So just so I understand, you're talking about taking an absentee ballot to a drop box
Yes.
that you already had, or that
Someone may had say, I would like you to drop this in the drop box. I didn't know if we could drop it in there for them or if they have to do it themselves.
So that's never usually a great idea. Legally, you have to provide a transmittal sheet if you're going to drop off anyone's ballot anywhere, even the registration. That's usually the case. So you're not supposed to be completing forms, and unfortunately, there is language in the code that says if you have someone's express written permission to do so, but in that scenario, you're not getting express written permission to do that. So I don't think it's a good idea.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Simone, there was in the chat box, and I think at this time you were talking about military people, and someone responded, Mr. Gatson responded, feds are give 3 days after voting for ballots to be counted. I think that was at the point where you were talking about if you're in the military. That's where, unless Mr. Gatson has, I don't see, I'm trying to find him.
Let me see, is that a provisional question?
Yeah, it was more of a statement. I was thinking that I know, like with the military, there is a 3-day, you have to mail it and it has to reach within 3 days or something like that. Maybe, I'm not sure. And I don't see his name. I don't see Mr. Gatson, Travis Gatson.
I don't.
Oh, yeah, he dropped off.
Oh, okay.
I think that, so I think I've heard that if you are military and you are overseas in active duty, you can request an absentee ballot up until the day before at 5 p.m. I'm not positive if that's the case, and I would like to follow up for that. 72 hours reminds me of the provisional voting rules, which is different.
Maybe it was the provisional. Okay.
Okay. That's a slightly different thing, but
with the provisional ballot, is it incumbent on the voter to go to the elections office and make sure that it is okay?
Yep, the burden is on the voter to provide whatever was not there, whether it was the address confirmation or the residency confirmation for the county. The burden's definitely, it's on the voter after that.
Because we get provisional ballot as an option quite frequently, but that follow-up part is not always made known. That, so you can ask for a provisional ballot, and then the person fills out the ballot and thinks and walks away, and 3 days go by, 5 days go by, and have no idea that they probably needed to have gone to the
for sure. At minimum, to follow up and to make sure that it was counted, and I think that's what you're talking about, Pamela, because folks have followed up and found out that, oh, your ballot's not counted, or your ballot was only partially counted, but if you want to know why, you definitely have to do the due diligence, and it's a very short window of time, 3 days, but it's the voter's responsibility.
So a question that I had, someone asked me, can they drop the ballot off at their absentee ballot off closer to where they work, or do it have to be at their precinct?
An absentee doesn't have to be at your precinct. You can drop off an absentee ballot in person at the county registrar's office. You can put it in the mail. There's lots of different ways that you could, go ahead.
No, the question was, do you have to drop it off at the precinct in your county, or can you do it at another county?
Another county, correct. Like they work in
in the essence of time, this will be our last question.
Sure. No, it's going by mail, so it can go anywhere. Don't take it to a drop box outside of your county, but if you're not home,
that was the question. So they can't drop it off in a Fulton County drop box. They have to drop it off if they live in DeKalb. They have to drop it in a DeKalb box.
And you can find those locations on the website for your county.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Simone. Thank you so much. Absolutely. So